everybody. Welcome back. It's great to be with you. You've been enjoying an absolute buffet of wonderful treats the last 2 days, I'm sure. Everybody that CIE puts before you is an expert and an also wonderful presenter, so I'm sure you're just sopping up everything. And they've asked me to introduce the concept of religion in the state of Israel in an hour, which which is definitely a formidable thing, a task, but I'm sure we're all up to it. If it's late in the day for you, please just gird your loins, to use a biblical phrase, and we're going to tackle this very thorny subject. And to just get your juices flowing, I thought we'd start off with a poll, right? Religion is definitely complex in Israel. I'd like to have a sense of who's out there. Where do you stand? So there's a poll before you. Do you think the role of religion in Israel is too much or just right or not enough? So let's hear. Okay, I think we could stop there. So we have basically 60% think too much, 30% think just right, it's about a third, and another 9% think not enough. Very close to the feelings in Israel, actually. If you listen to their surveys, it's very, very similar. So I think that that's helpful because what we want to understand is, why is it so complex? There's a great rule in political science. If a problem were simple, then a solution would have been found long ago. So this one of the reasons that this is an important topic is that many of us come to this situation in Israel with lenses from the West. And one of the things I want to do is sort of unpack the complexity. I don't have any answers, and I certainly don't have any predictions, but what I hope to give you in the hour is a deeper understanding where the tensions, where the conflicts, where the complexities come from, so that you can take it apart and think about it in more helpful ways and more nuanced ways, rather than simply, is it good or is it bad? So we'll get rid of the poll and we'll move on. Okay. So thank you all for that. Let's see, there we go. The 4 contexts that I think are important to understand, and we'll pretty much go through the first one somewhat slowly, the second one a little bit faster, and then ideological, and then historical. So what I mean by conceptual, we all come to this topic with concepts in our mind regarding what we mean by religion, what we mean by state, and what relationship we think it should have. And I want to go over a little bit of that history to understand that we don't all agree. When we say religion, we don't all necessarily are thinking of the same thing, even though we're using the same word. And the same thing with the state. Essential. What do we mean when we say Judaism versus the Jewish people? What are we talking about? How did that come about? What used to be a more organic, holistic, integrated sense of Judaism and Jews now seems to be riven. It's bifurcated. So how did that happen? And what does it mean for this question of religion in the modern state? Ideologically, it's important to distinguish, there's Zionism, and then those who are very, orthodox in their views about Judaism also have a particular ideology that we'll talk about. We'll really focus on the Haredim there, but also the religious Zionists. And then historically, we need to unpack what's going on, because I want to submit to you that Israel is already 72 years old, and the Yishuv before that, so the project is over 120 years old. Different events have impact on this question of religion and state. It's not a static thing. It's not an issue that once a Supreme Court decides it, it's settled. It's constantly evolving, and because Israel is a small country with a lot of people in it, we have to talk about what are the factors that influence this delicate balance between religion and state, and why sometimes people think it needs to change, sometimes people think it doesn't. Okay, so I'm actually going to start with a little bit of medieval history, right? And I'm only going to go through it quickly. You have the slides, so you can look at this in the future. The first thing is to understand, how did the West, and when I say the West, I really mean Europe, primarily Central and Western Europe, how did they come to understand religion the way we do today? We're really heirs of this tradition. So the first thing to understand is the Protestant Reformation, starting with Martin Luther in the early 1500s. He had a totally new understanding of what Christianity should be. He thought, instead of what he called the works, the focus of the Catholic Church on, doing a penance or giving alms, and it shouldn't be that. It needs to be something that you simply believe. Your justification is by faith alone, not by anything you do, because we're mired in sin, and only God's grace saves us from that original sin. Sola scriptura, he didn't believe in institutions. There's no such thing as the church. The people who knew how to study the Bible could tell you what it meant, and sola scriptura means by scripture alone. So again, to take it away from the institutions. But within less than 2 decades, there were already 4 different Protestant denominations because of what Martin Luther unleashed. And that actually led, between Catholics and then even between Protestant denominations, there was about 120 years of fighting going on in Central and Western Europe, but most especially between Catholics and Protestants. That kind of sustained conflict forced people to think differently, made people wonder, is there another way? Because I'm not going to convince you and you're not going to convince me. Are we just going to continue fighting? So there are 2 other things that need to be understood, and you'll see how they all fit into what we're going to talk about. The second movement is the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was an idea or a movement that basically claimed we're not going to take truth from authority. Something is not correct simply because the church said so, or the Pope declared it so, or because of tradition. That's not enough to say, well, my grandparents felt this way, or my parents did this, so I'm going to do it. That's not enough. What makes us human is our use of reason and logic, being able to think things through. And science was a whole new way of establishing truth. You have to be able to prove it. You can use logic, you could use the scientific method, but all questions are open until we can prove them one way or the other. So what is religion? Religion is a personal domain. Back to Martin Luther, it's that interiority, it's that feeling that you have inside. And frankly, no one's going to be able to, as I said earlier, convince one another. So we're just going to tolerate one another. We'll talk about that in the next slide. But what every religion must have is a core of ethics. Right? You have to not steal, you have to not murder, you have to they thought, all the kind of interpersonal thing. Every religion, to be accepted into society, had to show that it was ethical. And in fact, however you dress it, whether you have a Sermon on the Mount by Jesus, or Muhammad has a couple of surahs in the Quran, or Jews have the holiness code in Leviticus, as long as they all have this ethical core, how they get dressed up. So one puts on a yarmulke, one puts on a vestment, one puts on a robe, whatever it might be, it doesn't make a difference, because that's all the external trappings of an ethical core. And that's something we can share in common, even if Protestants and Catholics disagreed. No less important is the concept of a nation state. Because of these battles that went on for 120 years, and it always involved lords or princes, even kings got involved, they had to come up with a way how to stop these battles. And the concept was the following. It was really a breakthrough concept. It says, what justifies a political boundary? Not the might of a ruler, not the military power of an army. Because if that's the only thing that justifies a boundary, then we're going to be at war constantly. But there's an internal integrity. There's a demographic cohesion that justifies why the state is shaped the way it is. So if you would come out of the Atlantic and come up to France, you would hear French, you would smell cheese, you would, drink wine, and you would, hear people talking about different authors, I don't know, Montesquieu or somebody like that, and then you continue traveling east, and then suddenly you see that there's a lot of meat, and and you hear a different language entirely. It's German, and people are drinking beer, and it's a very different kind of society, and that's okay because France should be for the French, and Germany should be for the Germans, and that way you don't have to worry about battling because. Right? Germany should not try to get French territory because that belongs to the nation state of the French. And the French should not battle the Germans because that belongs to the Germans. Okay? So what makes a nation? A nation is a people with common history, laws, culture, right? Language. The political borders should follow pretty much that national or ethnic identity, not religious. So now you could see that if the identity of all of us living in France is that we're French, but some of us choose to be Catholic and some of us choose to be Protestant, namely the Huguenots, we can live together because we are part of a single nation. Okay? And the state wanted to have a direct relationship with each citizen. You are a member of French state. You're a citizen of the state. You're a member of the French people. Okay, so no sub-societies. So what then is religion? So as we said, it's this ethical core, and it's a matter of personal conscience. What then should the state's attitude be towards religion? John Locke famously wrote in 1689, toleration. We're not going to dictate to you matters of conscience. The nation will be built out of the people with a common history, laws, culture, right, the literature and the language, but not necessarily religion. So part of it is also both the Enlightenment and this idea of the nation state is pushing religion to a smaller and smaller corner of one's life, right? So the public sphere, the civil sphere is something we can all share. But then on Sunday, you go to a Protestant church, I go to a Catholic church, or so whatever it might be, and we can each respect one another because we're part of a single nation. So we come to one of the key concepts in the 18th century, in the 1700s, which is separating the state and religion. So jot down, we're heirs of this whole debate, this whole discussion. We are in America, but there are other countries that are also heirs to this conversation. Write down in the chat one way that you would say a society could separate state and religion. And don't think only of the United States, because we have a certain form of it. Think of other ways a state could separate itself from religion, from a single religion, let's say. Just take about 15, 20 seconds. Okay, Rich, do you have any that you could read out, please? You have to unmute yourself, though.
Yeah, we have education, civil marriage.
Okay, civil marriage, great idea. Okay, so that was actually a debate. Should there be a place where the state stays out of marriage and allows the religious sphere to take that over? Or does the state say, no, we will control religion? We will control marriage. And in fact, the famous statement in America, by the power vested in me by the state of New York, I now pronounce you man and wife. The cleric is an agent of the state, right? Other suggestions of separating.
No religion in the public square or public sphere.
Okay, so
public space.
Okay, so that's making a neutral or almost non-theistic space for everybody to feel comfortable. Clearly in America, we have a national holiday called Christmas, right? Now, over the last 10 years, there have been lawsuits about clearing out the public sphere. But actually, one of the things we're moving towards is not clearing out the space, but actually piling on more and more, right? The more the merrier, the menorah and the Muslim, and have the call to prayer from the minarets to go out in the public sphere. Right? That's another way. It's not that it's separating the state from religion, but it's saying the state will not favor any religion. That's another way of thinking. So it's going to be equal in its treatment to all religions. Okay, some of you might have seen that a court just ruled the Supreme Court just ruled today that you cannot exclude, that are general programs for education, you can't exclude religious schools. I know if there's a program for special needs students, all right, everybody's got to get it, including religious schools. So that's another way. Now, England has the Church of England. How do they separate? So they have no problem saying, look, England and the state, the Church of England are one. The Queen is the head of the church, but we tolerate everybody. And in fact, we have an Archbishop of Canterbury and we have a chief rabbi. It's okay to have a chief rabbi, right? Because we're kind of all equivalent, right? So you see, sometimes it gets difficult because if it's a nation state, but the nation has a religious tradition that it identifies very, very strongly with. Think of Russia, think of Poland and the Catholic Church, right? The Russian and the Russian Orthodox. When a nation is so closely wedded to a particular religion, it's a lot harder to think about the American approach as being appropriate. Okay, so I want you to keep that in the back of your mind as we move on to the next. What are Jews, right? That the question is the essence. What does it mean to be a Jew? So in light of what we just discussed, there was a debate in the French National Assembly on the eligibility of Jews for citizenship. And it was a fierce debate, and it actually got extended for almost 2 years because they didn't want to vote on it because it was such a difficult decision to be made, right? So quickly, if you were coming from it, the question from a perspective of enlightenment, should you give Jews citizenship? I think we'd all agree the answer is yes. They're human, right? As long as they show that their religion has an ethical core, we should accept them in. But the nation state, said Bishop de la Fere, he said, are we going to accept a fifth column into our own state and call them equal citizens? Right? Do we accept every Dane or Brit, somebody from England, and call them a Frenchman just because they happen to be living here? Jews pray to leave. Jews face Jerusalem. Jews have a different language. They have a different holiday schedule. They have a different set of laws. We don't have to accept into our midst a state within a state. And because of that debate, the decision was, in essence, a conditional emancipation. On the bottom of the slide, this is the language of Count Clermont-Tonnerre. The Jews should be denied everything as a nation, but granted everything as individuals. Again, the Reformation, that individual feeling, you want to be a private Jew in the house, that's your business. But you have to shed all the national trappings of what it means to be a Jew, okay? And that question of emancipation forced the following. So in the pre-modern period, the Jewish people observed the Jewish religion was all one. The modern period with emancipation, certainly in the West and Central Europe, is saying, are you a Jewish religion or are you a Jewish people? If you want to join the French people, then you have to decide what it means to be Jewish in religion, but you can no longer be Jewish in a sense of peoplehood. You have to drop the national dimension of Jewishness. And this was something that led, we're not going to go into it, to different approaches. Reform on the top right? They embraced the Enlightenment values and ideas, and they wanted to be fully part of the host nation. Those of you who might be familiar with the Pittsburgh Platform in America, 1885, they actually say in one of their planks in the platform, we are no longer a nation, we are a religious community. We're American, we're French, we're British, of the Mosaic persuasion, of the Israelite religion, but we are not a Jewish nation anymore. The historical school, the precursor to conservative Judaism, had a slightly different take. They believed that what the Jewish people over its history had sanctified through practice had to be preserved. They didn't want to change everything like reform, but they also wanted to be part of the German nation. They wanted to be so they wanted to be sort of both German and Jews. And the neo-Orthodox under Samson Raphael Hirsch actually says the Yisroel Mensch, that you're Jewish and German fully. And that requires, that's why he developed the dual curriculum school, the day school. So you studied the German culture and you studied the Jewish religious culture in the same day, so that you would be nurturing the two halves of yourself. The ultra-Orthodox on the bottom left, they reject Enlightenment values and ideas. They find this idea of science and this idea of truth and ethics. We just do what our ancestors told us, whatever was at Sinai, and they see themselves as separate from the host nation. They have no interest in becoming German or Hungarian or any of the other kind of nationalities that were abounding in Europe at the time. So this was the situation. I want you to understand that Jews in the Central and Western Europe are being asked, are you going to join us as a member of our nation, or are you going to maintain Jewishness as a separate peoplehood? And so there was a lot of religious adjustment, and you get denominations. What about Eastern Europe? Well, there was almost nothing similar to Western and Central Europe in Eastern Europe. Politically, they were still non-constitutional monarchies, or they were empires. They were part of the Austro-Hungary Empire or under the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. So the Jews of Eastern Europe were not being offered emancipation, right? And when it did come, it only came really in the early 20th century. Economically, it's still a largely feudal society in Eastern Europe. There is an emerging middle class, but it's much more limited than the bourgeoisie of Central and Western Europe. But there is rapid industrialization going on, which is creating more of a have and have-nots disparity in Russia. And Jews are kind of caught in the middle. They can't fully participate in industrialization, but they don't own land. So they're not part of the feudal society. They're kind of betwixt and between. Intellectually, Eastern Europe is much slower to get enlightenment. It is moving east, but slowly. And more so than enlightenment religion, they're just simply secularizing and in the cities. So people believe that there's a Catholic Church, but they're observing it less. There are people who are, of course, there are always the intelligentsia who want to oppose. But for the most part, people are not making a stand. They're not creating a Reform Judaism or a conservative Judaism. They're not creating all these denominations. There's the Catholic Church and the Russian Orthodox Church. And variety is just in terms of your personal practice. You don't make new denominations. But the crucial thing to understand about Eastern Europe is the demographic. Many diverse ethnic minorities live under these larger powers. And just to give you a quick sense, I can't make it that much bigger, but you could see how in Eastern Europe, so you see the Germans are in the middle and then the Italians. That's big, right? They're almost all ethnic Germans. But once you go to the right and you look at Poles, so look at all the different groups. You have Hungarians, Slovaks, Czechs, Croats, Bosnians, right? Ukrainians, Romanians, Bulgarians, Georgians, Belarusians, Lithuanians, right? There are all these ethnic groups that are recognized. They have their own languages, they have their own cultures, they have their own cuisines. Some of them have their own literature, right? They have their own heroes. They think of their history as Russia conquered us, and we've been trying to throw up the yoke of Russia, right? The Poles certainly thought that. So you could see there's a lot more ethnic nationalist diversity in Eastern Europe, and that has an impact on the Jews. So in Eastern Europe, how do Jews see themselves? They're not wondering, should we be emancipated or whatever. For the most part, again, there are exceptions, but for the most part, they see themselves as an ethnic minority, no different than Poles, no different than Latvians, no different than Ukrainians. They have their own language, Yiddish or Hebrew. They have their own religion. They have their own laws, religious practices, or their own courts to deal with their own issues of status. They're endogamous. They marry among their own. And part of that is also coming from the outside. The outside is excluding them. They have legal disabilities. When the state actually says Jews can only live here, the state is singling them out as a minority, that they have a national identity, or at least an ethnic identity. There's economic exploitation, taxes targeting Jews in particular. And of course, we know about the anti-Semitism and the pogroms that begin after the assassination of the Tsar that profoundly affects the way Jews see. Like, if there was any hope in the 1860s and 70s that they might be able to integrate somewhat into Eastern Europe and Russia, it ends, right? The Russian state was seen as complicit in the pogroms, certainly not helping the Jews and probably even aiding the people who committed the atrocities. So they said, there's no hope here. And that's when the big emigration to America, or just even to Central Europe begins, and of course some to Palestine. So again, this is a good, we come back to the slide, what's the essence of Jewishness? That division that we spoke about with the nation state and the Enlightenment, that was tipping in Eastern Europe. If you look at the right side of your slide, yeah, we're more of a Jewish people, even if I'm not so observant, right? If I go to a Passover Seder, it's my culture. It's part of my ethnic identity to have these practices. And Yiddish was very important to them, or Jewish art, and they start to have music like klezmer, right? Their religious identity is now being subsumed for many as part of a cultural identity as well. Whereas in Western Europe, if there's going to be difference, it's that, no, we're French and German citizens. Where there's diversity, it's that the religious choices we individually make. I want to be Reform, I want to be Orthodox, I want to be conservative. So there is diversity among Jews, but look at how different it is. And this has an impact on how each one will view religion. Before we leave Europe, we should also be aware of the rise of modern anti-Semitism. Most historians put it on 1879 because an official party ran for the parliament in Germany as an anti-Semitic platform to roll back the political gains of the Jews. And they were using Darwin's science of races to say the reason Jews, right, they got this emancipation, but what are they doing with it? They're exploiting us, right? They're raping us economically, right? On the right is a Rothschild, right? Look at the talent. It's like a demonic. They worship money. Look at the crown Rothschild is wearing. It's the golden calf, right? The Jewish threat is the middle. That's the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in French. Alfred Dreyfus, the Dreyfus Affair of 1893, they called him, not only did they say they court-martial him for treason, and it was totally trumped up. He was totally framed. But outside the court-martial, the crowds, the mobs were chanting, "Death to the Jews." Death to the Jews, not death to Dreyfus, death to the Jews. So even after almost 100 years of emancipation in France, it seems that the Jews could not really be assimilated fully.
Michael, if you don't mind, there was a question about about the restrictions placed on the Jewish minorities in the Russian Empire, and the participant is curious if there were similar restrictions on other ethnic minorities living in Russia.
Actually, there were some economic. There was the trades that they could do, but in terms of like limiting them to a territory like did the Jews in terms of a Pale of settlement, that they didn't do to other groups. But there was some economic restrictions on other groups as to really more of a protectionist kind of thing. That was a very good question. I'm going to pause when we get to the end of this section for questions. Good questions. Now, I don't want to forget that there are Jews in Arab lands because they're going to make a very big showing in a couple of minutes, right, when we start to get to Zionism. The Jews in Arab lands. So the Muslims didn't share, right? They didn't go through a Reformation and an Enlightenment and the idea of a nation state. They already had the idea that the Persians were Shiites, right, in Iran, what's today Iran. And Saudi Arabia was already emerging as a Sunni stronghold of Wahhabism. The idea that they had notions of ethnic subgroups within the Arab world, but they were closely wedded to religious viewpoints. There was not this exclusion of religion from one's identity. So Jews were seen as a distinctive subculture in all of the Arab lands, in North Africa, in the Middle East, in Yemen, right? They had their own ways. They were not Muslim, and they clearly had their own way. They had a category, they were called dhimmis, which was a kind of second-class citizenship for people who believed in a revelation. So there was already a category and centuries of certain kinds of exclusion, but yet economically they were very well integrated into the landscape of the Arab lands. Colonialism brings Western and European categories. So they say, oh, we know you Jews, right? We have you back in France, or we have you back in Holland, or we have you back in England. And some of those countries do emancipate their Jews, but for the most part, they remain unemancipated in the colonies. The important thing to understand is that with the colonialism comes secularism. And again, it's not just Jews. There are many Arab secularists, right? Think about later on Nasser, but in the early 20th century, a lot of Arab nationalists who are very secular. And in other countries like Turkey, right? We know Ataturk, also to separate a secular identity from a religious identity. But still, Jews retain the view of religious life as traditional, meaning whatever they personally observe, to be Jewish religiously is to keep Shabbat, to keep kosher, right, to go pray in a synagogue. All those things are how to keep the holidays. All of that is sort of part of their perception. So we now can turn to, right, if there's Eastern European anti-Semitic violence, so there's just some example programs. Look at the map on the right? The red line is the Pale of Settlement. Look at how many pogroms, because that's where the Jews were forced to live. So they were concentrated, they were easy targets, right? And by the way, when they were targeted, it wasn't only the religious that were targeted. Even the secular Jews were targeted. And that really made everybody terrified and I guess hopeless that there was going to be any change in Eastern Europe. And then we saw the Dreyfus affair in Western and Central Europe. So the responses to anti-Semitism are going to be different. Eastern Europe, most of it is to emigrate. Some join socialism to try to reimagine a more ideal society that doesn't make any distinctions. But in Western Europe, they're going to seek legal redress. They're going to try to defend their rights. They'll lobby for legislation to protect them, or they will assimilate further. But it's for us, what we need to understand that the Zionisms are different. There's a political Zionism in Western Europe because Herzl wanted to maintain his Austrian identity. He wanted to speak his languages and read his literature from his native Austria, from Vienna. But in Eastern Europe, the Zionisms are much more nationalistic, cultural, labor, socialist. You could see how the different environments cause the emergence of different kinds of Zionism. The context really does play a big role. Look at the bottom of the slide. Religion doesn't fit into most forms of Zionism. Okay? Herzl was not particularly religious. It was a political campaign, as he understood it, to go to the Western powers to give them a plot of land and start a state very much in the model of a nation state like France. On the other hand, the Zionisms in Eastern Europe said, no, like we need a new Jew. We need a Jew who's speaking Hebrew. We need a Jew who's writing music and literature and creating new art. All right, we need a Jew who has a new vision for the world that is much more equitable and fair and doesn't have these distinctions. It's not really religious. So the anti-religious is primarily in Eastern Europe, the Zionism. So that was a cause for concern. And the political Zionists, like Herzl, they didn't think the religious Zionists would really be that politically active, but they had no problem joining them. The Mizrahi do join them, do join the political Herzl party in the Zionist Congress. But for the most part, Herzl's not that interested in religion. So I want to pause here for any questions before we go on to the last two contexts for understanding religion. Any questions?
Any questions? There's not really any in the chat, so
okay, that's fine. So, but I want people to understand that when Zionism is starting, it's almost either not interested in religion or opposed in the Eastern European model to that old diaspora Jew, the Galuti Jew, the Jew who cowers, the Jew who stays in shul and davens when there's a pogrom, right? That's not going to help us. It's not going to solve our problems. And that leads to the ideological debates between Zionism and what we would call classical Judaism in Eastern Europe, the traditional orthodoxy. Why is there such tension between traditional rabbinic Judaism and the various forms of Zionism? Take a moment to throw in something perhaps to the chat, right? Why do you think there's such a tension between the two? Okay, Rich, if you could share some of the earliest answers, please.
Yeah, messianic ideas.
Great, great. Messianic, and the Zionists are saying, no, Messiah, we're going to do this ourselves. Good, next.
It's moving fast. Internalized anti-Semitism.
Interesting. Interesting that rabbinic Judaism, the classical, they just absorbed that self-image, and you have to shed that. Very good.
There was one. Seeing Judaism only as a religion.
So it's going to be interesting because the classical rabbinic Judaism sees themselves as a people as well. So we will look at that. Let's look at a more specific, like line by line comparison. So religious Judaism, and I'm focusing here on Eastern Europe, it's God-centered, right? Zionism says we're focusing on the people, right? Not God. We're not turning our eyes heavenward. We're looking to our colleagues and saying, what can we do, right? The answer from our first keynote together, how do you return to the land? By repenting. Let God do it. Zionism says, no, we have to initiate this. We're not going to wait for God. Religious Judaism, remember we spoke about how the rabbis after Bar Kokhba took the fangs out of Messianism and turned it into a utopian where the Jews would be passive and quiescent. No, the secular Zionism the secular Messianism, of Zionism would be, we will bring the change. We're not going to wait for God. We're not going to be on the sidelines. And halakha is supposed to be eternal. No, Zionism was portraying for many. Halakha is diasporic. It kept us united. It definitely did a good job, right? The famous Achad Ha'am, more than the Jews observed the Sabbath kept the Jews together. So it served its function, but now we cannot survive another day in Galut, in diaspora. We have to go back and build our own Jewish society. And if Yiddish with a little culture for religious Jews, right? And I realize I'm being a little bit glib here, but Zionism say we need a robust Hebrew culture. We need to write our own literature. We need our novels. We need our comic books, right? We need children's literature. We can't have just the Yiddish spoken in the street. We need newspapers. We need literature. We need songs. We need music that's going to be in the Hebrew language. So religious Judaism, the old Jewish mindset on the bottom left, God, Torah, and people are all one. The new Jewish mindset is the Jewish people are at the top of the pyramid. Not God, not Torah, but the people are on the top, right? And everything else, if it exists at all, serves them. So you could see how there's a clash that's going to happen between Haredi, ultra-Orthodox, and Zionists, because it is a real, in their view, the Haredi view, it is a rebellion, right? The fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe said it. It's clear on the third line, right? The Zionists must give nationalism precedence over the Torah, because it is known that those who cling to the Torah and the commandments are not likely to change and accept another identity. Hence, in order to implement their idea, I'm at the bottom, the Zionists must distort the essence of Jewishness, right? I would say it's a natural outgrowth of what's going on in the 1800s, but to a Lubavitcher Rebbe, he's saying it's a distortion. The essence of Jewishness is Judaism, is Torah, in order to get them to assume a different identity. And indeed, there was a lot to that. The Zionists wanted to fashion the new Jew. an educational system that would give them the good training about Jewish history and the people. The military would also acculturate all citizens and unite them in a common cause. The elevation of the collective. My individual needs are not as important as the collective, the kibbutz, a socialist economy where I essentially disappear and the klal, the collective, takes over. We have to live together. We don't want to be in these small pockets. We have to all live together and share. And we need to develop a culture, music, art, literature, right? A university in Hebrew. We have to totally fashion the Jew so that the diasporic Jew, the Galuti Jew, doesn't remain. So I set this up so that you understand the ultra-Orthodox demands from the state that have continued basically for the last 75 years, right? You want public education? We want separate education. You want a universal draft because that's going to acclimate everybody and help them acculturate to the new identity? We want to be exempted from the military. You want a socialist economy where everybody works? We're not going to work, or we're going to work among our own neighborhoods and we're not going to go make our forays into your world. You want us to all live together in a common pluralistic society. We want our separate neighborhoods where we can post our signs. If you're immodestly dressed, don't come here, right? And you want a robust culture. We want to have nothing to do with your culture. We don't want your movies. We don't want your newspapers. We don't want your literature. We don't want your poetry. We don't want your music, right? We're going to keep it all out. And indeed, the ultra-Orthodox have created the separate media. What about the laws of the state? That's a very big issue, right? How do you do, right? How will the ultra-Orthodox abide by the laws of the state? And that continues to be an issue. But before we leave the antagonism between traditional Judaism and Zionism, there was a small minority of a handful of religious who did embrace the Zionist project. Some, like Reines, took a pragmatic approach, right? Don't forget the pogroms, it still led in 1881 to terrible consequences, economic and other personal ones. The Jews are all leaving because they cannot continue to live in Russia. So the Zionists are simply creating an alternative so that the Jews can go and survive and leave from the oppression in Russia. And their mission statement is a little bit more idealistic. It's not just pragmatic, right? Mizrahi comes, if you look at the bottom left, spiritual center, Merkaz Ruchani. It doesn't come from east. Mizrahi is Merkaz Mem Zayin Reish Chet Yud, Merkaz Ruchani, a spiritual center. All right. Their mission statement is called the Kol Koreh in 1902. We have not found any other way for our Torah to exist after Zion is rebuilt, except by guarding the true Judaism in all its aspects and in all its purity. Zionism and Torah are two holy vessels which complement one another and need one another. They want to be the hyphen. They want to fuse the Zionist project with traditional religion. Zev Yavetz, the one who actually wrote the platform, right? It's a beautiful line. It says, I want to show those opposed to Zionism, right? The religious who are opposed to Zionism to love Zion, and I want to show the people who are Zionists who hate religion to love Judaism. It would be our wish to take these two and to synthesize them into one total Judaism, which retains the Torah as its soul, the nation as it's body, with its place in Eretz Israel. And that's going to be something to understand about religious Zionists, which we'll take up near the end. Rav Kook, a mystic, he embraced through his passion for all love of all Jews. I'm simplifying here, but he is able mystically to take in all the dialectic that the non-religious, the secular Zionists will eventually come back to religion. He believed that they had to unleash certain hidden powers among the Jews because they were suppressed in diaspora, but they can now be unleashed. He gave a blessing at the opening of the Hebrew University. He sent a letter of support for the Bezalel Art School. He wrote poetry and music. So he did believe in the cultural renaissance, but he thought ultimately it would merge with Judaism, and the synthesis, the integration of the secular Zionists with the traditional religionists would be a greater whole. Okay, so before we go on, are there any questions that people might have? So now we see that most ultra-Orthodox are opposed to Zionism, but there's a small religious Zionist group that is emerging that wants to participate in the Zionist project, either out of practical reasons, pragmatically, or because of idealistic reasons to make sure that the Jewish state has religion in it. Okay?
I don't see any questions, so let's
okay. So we're going to use our last quarter hour to talk about the history, and this is what I want to leave you with primarily, and that is to understand that the evolving character of the relation of religion and state in Israel is very often a function of different historical factors. And that's the essential question of the last 15 minutes. What are the factors that influence the relationship of religion and state in Israel? I would say it would be true of all countries, but we're focusing on Israel. How do we need to think about that? So the first is demographics, right? When the early Zionists came to Palestine, the old Yishuv was primarily ultra-Orthodox. That's who was there. The pioneers who come, some of the early pioneers, like in Chibat Zion, were some of them were religious, but more and more they're secular. So the balance is shifting, right? Who's in Israel, and what do they represent, and are they participating? So there are some religious, but it's not a large number. But it does start to grow in the 19 teens and in the 1920s, particularly after World War I. The questions I always want you to ask yourselves, okay, is where did they come from? So let's think about it. If they're coming from Eastern Europe, they're either going to reject religion or think about religion as, right, oh, that's the guys in the long black coats with the fur hats, that's what they do, that's religion. If they're coming from Western Europe, then they're going to think of reform, they're going to think of conservative, they're going to think of modern Orthodox. They'll have other ways of thinking about religion. And if they're coming from Arab lands, we have to think about that, right? At this point, it's not a large number, but when they come from there, they're also going to represent sort of a traditional anchor rather than a Western European denominationalism. So what did they find when they arrived? Were there synagogues? So if there's no synagogue and you want to pray, but you're the only one on a kibbutz, you might just say, you know what, it's not worth it. But if you're coming and there's a developed religious infrastructure, then you might go to it or you might support it, right? And how did they view the Jewish religion versus Jewish people? So I really want you to think about that as we come to the end of this session. And as you think about Russian aliyah, right? What would that cause? And so if we have time, we'll get back to that at the end, okay? Historical factor number 2, the political framework and its institutions. The Ottoman Empire wanted the Jews of Palestine to be led by a chief rabbi. And when the British took over and got the mandate from the League of Nations to run Palestine, they continued and in fact expanded the role of the chief rabbi. There was now an Ashkenazi and a Sephardi chief rabbi, right? And they're going to bring their Christian views of religion, right? They're going to believe in freedom of religion. So you have to think about the framework, the politics, and the institutions. The Jewish Agency wants to begin an educational system. They want to teach Bible. Well, that's going to cause friction between the traditionalists who say the Bible is the word of God and the educational system that says the Bible is the product of our nation. It's our nation's book, and it was written by people, but it tells our story, right? Cultural sites are pulling from biblical and rabbinic sources. You always have to think about the names of streets. They're starting to use Rambam, think about there's so much that Israel pulls from in terms of its institutions that it's very hard to not think in religious terms. All right, but this is what leads us to your handout number 1, which was sent to you. and that was the letter that Ben-Gurion sent to Agudath Israel, the World Federation of Agudath Israel, that they had to guarantee religious freedom for the UN to give Israel a charter as a nation among the nations of the world. It had to guarantee religious freedom. And would you believe it? Who do they have to guarantee it to? To the ultra-Orthodox. They're not worried about the Jews giving freedom of religion to Muslims or Christians. Will the Jews give freedom of religion to other Jews? That was the thing that they had to defend. And if you read the handout, in the letter, he guarantees, well, at least says he'll work very hard, that Shabbat will be the state's legal day of rest. This is what comes to be known as the status quo. That kashrut, every state kitchen intended for Jews will have kosher food so that Jews will be able to participate. By the way, a lot of this was the achievement of interestingly enough, the religious Zionists who wanted to be able to serve in the army and serve in government. Marital affairs to prevent a rift in the Jewish people. The rabbinate gets the right to administer all changes of status, marriage and divorce and conversion. And education, the government itself is going to guarantee a two-track system. There'll be a secular religious system, mamlachti, and a religious educational system. So Ben-Gurion actually guarantees this, and that governs the relations between religion and state for several decades. Okay, so you should see all this is playing out really almost primarily among Jews from Eastern Europe who need to learn to live together. Okay, and when you look, and this leads us to the next thing, if you look at the handout number 2, what Ben-Gurion looks back, he's very practical. He says, we have a lot of hard work to build a country together. It's a coalition. Every party can vote for its own members. I need them. I want to have majorities of 65, 75, 80% to vote on the things that matter to me. And you know what coalition means? Horse trading, right? I'm going to give for you and you're going to give for me. And if for you to participate in the government, you religious people, to vote with the government, you need to have kashrut and you need to have this. I am willing, I have my eye on the prize, wrote Ben-Gurion. What's more important to me is building a state. I need their help. That doesn't happen in America, all right? Ben-Gurion thought eventually it would dissolve into a two-party system. It didn't happen that way. But when you have political mobilization and coalition negotiation, that any group that has a new ideology can put together a party and run and get seats in the Knesset and then negotiate to be part of the coalition, that's going to have an impact on the role of religion in the state, right? Write down in the chat some examples you might know of in the last 25, 30 years where this factor in Israel, political mobilization and coalition negotiation, had an impact on religion in Israel.
The breakdown of the Kotel Compromise.
Excellent, right? That was because it was agreed by one government, new government, they want to scratch it, right?
Women of the Wall.
Okay, that's still close to the same thing.
Kind of related, yeah. I mean, for sure, the Tal Law would be one.
Excellent. Yesh Atid wants to be a party to draft those darn Haredim. Like that was their, right? They've been freeloading for too long. Draft them, right? And Yesh Atid becomes part of the government, right? And the Tal Law is a result of that. Excellent. So you see, and think about the Russian, right? Israel Beitenu, that they want to come in and they also want to be a more secular public sphere. If you can mobilize, you can have coalition negotiation. I wanted to show you a video of Shas, but I'm going to pass on it because we're running out of time. Shas, right? Ovadia Yosef, he's a rabbinic figure, a former chief rabbi, a Sephardic chief rabbi. He mobilizes the Sephardim, the Mizrahim into a party, and they vote to get a piece of the budget, the national budget. Right? So the historical factors are the last thing to consider, right? The religion in the state post-1948. Look at all of the Jews from Arab lands. They come with their sensibilities. or the World War II refugees, primarily from Eastern Europe, they come with their sensibilities about what religion is. They have no problem that there's this chief rabbi who's all dressed up and acts away and talks a certain way. Let them, that's great. That's what Orthodox Jews do. The idea of pluralism hadn't come to Israel, and it wasn't going to come until there was going to be a big wave, if ever, from Western Europe and from America. But as long as they're coming from Arab lands, and then they come from Russia, which was where Judaism was cultural, you're not going to see that much objection to Orthodoxy being the official religion. But there were other things. The 6-Day War, it was miraculous, right? It restored biblical Israel. The Bible became alive. It changed the way people read Tanakh, right? The religious Zionists, the heirs of Rav Kook, became much, much more emboldened and powerful because they said, what's happening is God's providence. This is the messianic plan unfolding. The state and its organ, the IDF, is God's rod. God is punishing the Arabs because he is now unfolding the messianic era, right? And that led to a lot of the excitement of the religious Zionist camp, what we call some of them are settlers. But the idea of the pioneer, we have to settle the land, just like Abraham and Isaac. We don't want to give an inch. The idea that land becomes so important to the religious Zionists is a result of the 73 war. Gush Emunim is a result. The nation of Israel and the land of Israel living according to the Torah of Israel. It's no surprise, look at the bubble on the right, 30+% of IDF officers are religious Zionists because they believe it's an idealism, it's a calling, it's a historic religious moment. When I serve as an officer, I am fulfilling a religious calling, right? And Tzvi Yehuda Kook, Rav Kook's son, believes, right, look at 1967, we have returned home by divine command to the city of our temple. From today onwards, we will not move from here. So religious Zionists are infused with religion, but they're looking at history a certain way. And that's why Oslo was so unsettling to them. And there was a whole introspection going on after the Rabin assassination by a member of the religious Zionist camp, because he thought this was an undoing of the messianic plan. And they have issues constantly. On the one hand, they are deeply committed to working with the Jewish people as a whole. So they roll up their sleeves and they participate in everything, in the universities, in business, in the army, and in education. They teach in all kinds of schools. On the other hand, they have a messianic vision that drives, not all of them, but some of them. They settle in the parts of Israel that other people don't want, but they do care about their fellow Jews. So other religious Zionist enterprises, the Gavis and Medad covenant, a new coexistence. They want to scrap the old status quo and come up with a new status quo. A Beit Hillel to focus on the spiritual leadership, and so are fighting for a more ethical, inclusive, and inspiring Jewish Israel. Not the Haredim who run a lot of the rabbinate, but something that's more inclusive, and they run marriages and conversions, and they're even now starting kashrut. So here are your main takeaways: that the idea of religion and state, the concepts themselves, is complex, and they evolve. The Jews around the world experienced their entry into modernity differently, which led to viewing what it means to be Jewish and what Judaism means. They view that differently, and they're all coming into Israel. Right? The birth of Zionism puts it at odds with most religious Jews, but there's a small group of religious Zionists that start to think differently, and eventually they become a very prominent part of Israel. And religion in Israel is dynamic, and it's affected by four main factors: the demographics and immigration. It's like the Russian Aliyah. They want a secular Israel. There's going to be pork raised in Israel for the first time, right, because they're voting for it. The political frameworks, the political mobilization and coalition politics, where it's about negotiation, and major historical events. So I hope that you see now the reason it's so hard to teach religion in Israel is because it is so frustratingly complex. And I hope I gave you a window today into why it's so complex, but it also, we can help our students understand the nuances by having them examine, when you say religion, what do you mean? If it's my personal belief, well, not everybody thinks that that's all religion is, and try to understand that they're coming out of an American milieu, right? Some people view it as culture. They may be coming from a different milieu. Sfardim, Mizrahim have another understanding. So helping our students understand that they're operating with certain assumptions that they may want to examine to understand that Israel may have a different way of pulling it together, right, may create an opening to think about religion in Israel, not exclusively in American terms, but in more complex and sophisticated terms. It's all right, 2 minutes over, but
all right. I think we have time for at least one question.
Excellent. I'd love to take it.
Jonathan in Boston writes, how do you read the recent moves in Tel Aviv and other municipalities to have buses on Shabbat in light of the history of religion and state in Israel? Of course, this could be a session unto itself, right? Yes,
actually, Rich and I put together a session a couple of years ago exactly on this question, and we found out it goes back to the 1930s. So it's not new. It is a question of access. It's a question of what is the role of government? What is the role of the state? Should the state have a character? It's more people are, I would say, a lot due to the internet, they're absorbing a Western sensibility that religion is my private individual decision, and I should basically not legislate for you what your observance of Shabbat should be. If I want to do Shabbat on Friday night or whatever, actually that's on the rise among young religious people in Tel Aviv. But buses, that means people will not be able to get around without it. And so it's a question of defining the public sphere in Israel, which is also something that is evolving, which is another whole subject. But buses are our main issue, because now that places are open and you can go places on Shabbat, people want to be able to get there who don't have cars. And so you're basically isolating the people when you say no buses allowed, especially those on the lower end of the economic spectrum who can't afford car services or their own cars. But please understand what's happening is the American idea and the Western European idea of the private, that religion is a matter of my personal conscience and my own interior beliefs, that is starting to hold sway in Israel. And that's creating the tension where, well, is the Kotel a national shul? Right? And you got to have something that can have everybody. I actually liked Sharansky's compromise. I was sorry to see that it broke down, but these things are evolving, and as long as coalition politics will govern Israeli politics, I think it'll be very hard to move the needle on this, because every few years it changes, the balance changes.